we look forward to the rest of 2018, the question should arise, what is going to happen to the global economy in the coming year? We'll be talking about that a lot in the weeks to come, but here to give us some insight on that is Nomi Prins. Nomi has not been on the show for quite a while. She is an author, she is a speaker and a writer with considerable experience in the financial sector and in writing about the financial sector. She has a book coming out in May, I believe, on central bankers, on the world's central bankers, entitled Collusion, and she joins us now. So first of all, Nomi, thanks for coming back on the program.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
So I was struck by a brief piece you wrote recently, My Financial Roadmap for 2018, and we can go into some of your specific thoughts on it. But overall, the impression I got from your prognostication in this piece was not dissimilar to the impression I've had for some time, which is of the global economy as a kind of airplane flying at 30,000 feet while people use the pillows, if they put pillows on airplanes anymore, to patch leaking holes in the hull, and maybe one or two engines are out, but it's still flying. We're just doing everything we can, and we think it's going to stay in the air for a while, but maybe not the best way to fly an airplane. Does my metaphor make any sense to you?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, sometimes I'd call it sputtering versus flying, but one of the things that's happened for years, it's no different this year, but there are some transitional things to look out for, is that the central banks of the world have, I use the term collusion as part of the book's title, have decided to embark upon now a decade of working together to keep the value of money from an interest rate perspective cheap at zero or negative in some countries, have bought bonds or equities or corporates in some countries to elevate the value of these assets, have created asset bubbles, and have utilized the external features of those markets to indicate that somehow that means that the underlying foundational economy is as strong as the stock market levels or the debt market levels would warrant it to be. And there is no necessary correlation between the two. In fact, most people aren't participants in that stock market anyway, and a lot of this cheap money has flown, to use your metaphor, straight to the top of the speculative hierarchy in terms of the larger financial institutions and hedge funds and private equity funds. And it continues to stay there at the top because of the fabricated money that has been provided at the hands of the central banks. But we have wages at stagnant to slightly higher levels, but pretty much have not kept up anywhere near with those elevated levels. We have job participation in the labor force at 4-decade lows. We have mammoth amounts of individual debt, from consumer debt to credit card debt to auto loan debt to student loan debt, high levels of healthcare costs, regardless of what kind of insurance one is talking about, and a lot of real day-to-day things that impact real people that are on the ground.
Yeah, and I think, elsewhere in this program, I talk a little bit about the Deutsche Bank report that came out recently that underscores a couple of your points, and we talk a lot about and write about on this program some of the same issues, which I would boil down to from the perspective of a lot of people in the U.S. economy and in other economies, but especially I think in the U.S., that the numbers look so good, the headlines are so positive. Why doesn't it feel better subjectively? Why does it, unemployment figures are very strong, but as you point out, workforce participation is low, and the jobs that have been created since the 2008 financial crisis tend to be lower level service economy jobs and so on. Wages are stagnating, as you say, debt is accelerating. So basically what it sounds like is a global pattern of central bank behavior that's designed, in effect, to prop up the wealthiest among us with relatively little regard to the rest of the economy. Is that a fair summation, you think?
Yeah, I mean that is where the money that's been fabricated has gone. If you look at just the three largest central banks in the world, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of Japan, they're collectively holding about $14 trillion worth of assets on their books as part of their quantitative easing or quantitative and qualitative easing, if you're Japan, programs over the years. And even that amount, which is nearly equivalent to a good chunk of the US GDP, even that amount of asset holding has a much larger effect on financial institutions and on markets relative to actual real people. Because if a central bank is buying trillions of dollars of debt assets, or in the cases of Japan equities, or in the cases of the European Central Bank corporate bonds, it's elevating all of the rest of those markets as well, so that anything in those capital markets looks much better than its value would otherwise indicate, because it has these extra buyers, this extra demand. When there's demand for anything, and its price goes up, the value doesn't necessarily change, but the actual price that people will pay for it changes, which means all the institutions involved from a financial perspective or a corporate perspective get to mark their books up. The governments, which have issued mammoth amounts of debt, and therefore we have extreme amounts historically of public debt relative to GDP in the United States, throughout Europe and Japan and so forth, that's also been a byproduct of these central bank programs. So $14 trillion is a lot to begin with, but it has much farther reaching effects for capital markets and elevating the wealthy, the financial institutions, even the governments, who can look at the elevations of markets and feel like, or talk about, the fact that this means economies are doing better. The reason people don't feel it is that, again, most people aren't participants in those markets, and the money hasn't come to them. It hasn't elevated the money that's in their pockets. In fact, a lot of their expenses have increased, and a lot of the debt that they've had to take on in order to make ends meet has also increased, but they don't have the same help from a central bank or a government that these companies do, or that the wealthy have, by simply being able to borrow it at these cheap levels and use it for speculative purposes. So there's been this inequality that has accumulated in addition to what was already there, because of these central bank policies. And it's not something that gets discussed in the broader economy. So if someone feels like they're not making enough money, they're not making ends meet, their paychecks aren't stretching for more than a week or a month, which is mostly what we have in the United States and in other major countries, that's not because they are making it up. That's the actual result of their personal economies. And so there is there are two things going on in the world right now. There's the stuff at the top, and there's the stuff at the bottom. And what's going on at the top is fueled by artificial fabricated money, and what's going on at the bottom is real people's paychecks having to stretch by more and more, and feeling the instability that comes from that.
And in the moment, and again, we're talking with Nomi Prins, and in the moment, at least at this historical moment, I think what also happens is that people, in order to get by, need to borrow more and more, which, if anything, accelerates this process because it adds to the financialization of the economy. Now, I'm curious as to your thoughts about, one way that this current state of affairs that you described so well could have been used to help people would have been if, in fact, our government took on more debt while it was so cheap, while interest rates were so low, and invested significantly in infrastructure and job creation and other programs to increase the purchasing power of individuals and kind of grow what some people might call the real economy versus the financialized money, dealing with money economy. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, that's exactly right. I always go back to the example of Henry Ford at the turn of the last century, when he wanted to ensure that Ford cars would be the ones that were used most prevalently throughout the country. And the way, he wasn't perfect, but the way he chose to do that was to elevate the wages of the workers who were creating these cars such that they would be able to afford to buy the cars. And the philosophy was that if they're making enough money to buy my cars, A, that's good for my cars, B, that's good for them, so they'll stay my workers versus going and taking my secrets over to other car companies. And that will, in turn, elevate sort of the market for cars, but also whatever they're utilized to do, whatever products they're utilized to help move from place to place, whatever people they're being used to move from place to spend their money and so forth. And it just had this sort of knock-on effect. That's when you put money in people's pockets. And yes, if we had followed as a nation and as not just the United States, but in Europe and Japan and China and so forth, the path of using the central bank money if it was going to be created anyway, and using the debt if it was going to be created anyway, both of which happened, to have programs that do build infrastructure, that do manifest development, that do elevate wages. That would be a way to ensure more of a solid foundation for economic growth, as opposed to, yes, looking at the financialization of growth, which is simply speculative capital moving to the top that was availed to speculators very cheaply by central banks and by government policies. The issue is, and it's continually an issue, it's been an issue throughout decades, but it's become worse in the last 10 years because central banks have been involved as well, and sort of puffing up the amount of money out there and where it goes, is that the philosophy is just wrong. The idea that creating infrastructure is an expense rather than an investment, that developing, producing more research, hiring and paying for people, giving them more benefits is somehow an expense rather than an investment, has created a situation where money therefore doesn't go to these kinds of investments. It goes to speculative markets and creates bubbles because they just look better and are faster and are easier to inflate. And creating infrastructure is harder. It's a longer-term process. You have to find spots. You have to look at, long-term goals. You have to look at how much money is going to come in over a certain period of time to build that bridge or create that railroad track or to put in high-speed trains or whatever it might be. And that requires work. That requires thought. That requires ingenuity. That requires creativity. That requires money. And
it also requires risk, which is something that people seem intent on avoiding when they can use political power to do so, right?
Well, there is actually a lot more risk in highly elevated stock values for some of the companies that have bought their own stock, because the effect of them having used this cheap money to buy back or to purchase their own stock is to elevate it. It looks good on the surface, but they haven't necessarily changed their business plan, so inherently they're not necessarily stronger companies. There's a higher risk in that. If things turned around, if they can't pay their bills, if we do have a downturn, if they can't service the debt that they've taken on, if rates go up a smidge or even more than that and it becomes more expensive to do so, that's actually a broader risk to a larger collapse than looking at a long-term plan for building a bridge or a railroad track or airports or highways or whatever that might be. So it's just a question of looking at risk from speculation versus risk in a planned manner where you can actually manage it properly. You can't manage a bubble, really. I mean, that is what central banks are trying to do. They're trying to manage a bubble by continuing to infuse it with various forms of cheap money and quantitative easing and so forth. You can't actually manage an infrastructure project. You aren't always going to be right. There's going to be weather. There's going to be problems. But for the most part, with the right people involved at the right levels with the right plan, you have an idea over time of where that investment is going to go and how much you're going to get on the other side. It's just the time frame is longer.
Now, when we talk about the central banks and managing a bubble, which it seems to be the problem at hand, I mean, it reminds me of that old cliched saying about, he who rides a tiger cannot dismount. Is that what we're dealing with now, that they've invested so deeply in this bubble that any move to extricate them and us from it is too potentially risky, so they're just going to keep riding?
That's exactly right. That's really sort of the core of the roadmap you mentioned that I had out a week or so ago about 2018. But it's not dissimilar to what we've been experiencing over the past number of years. Is that central banks have collectively work together to keep the cost of money down, to keep rates down, and to purchase assets where needed, whether they're stocks or whether they're bonds or whether they're mortgage bonds or whether they're government bonds, in order to continue to inflate these bubbles. And that to turn that around, to exit from that strategy, and they don't actually have an exit plan for that strategy, would be very detrimental to every element of the financial system that depends upon it. So instead, what we get is the Fed's going to go into tightening mode. Well, okay, the Fed has raised rates by 75 basis points last year. They raised rates as well the year before. They might this year. But while they're doing that, they still have a tremendously big $4.5 trillion or so book of assets. So they've said, okay, well, we're going to let some of those assets slide off. We're not going to reinvest the interest of those assets back into similar assets on our books. But they haven't really done that. So the size of their asset book has remained relatively the same. And if it drops by like 10 billion or so in a week, we're talking about a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage, not enough to really fundamentally change the elevation that their program is giving to these types of debt. It's the same thing with the European Central Bank. For now 3 times, they've extended the time period for which they are doing their quantitative easing program, and then they say, well, we're actually reducing it last year because we're reducing the amount each month that we will purchase of bonds. Well, yes, they are reducing each month the amount they're purchasing, but they extended the number of months again by a year. So the net effect of that is actually more purchasing and more quantitative easing. So what they are saying as part of their potential exit strategy to sort of test the markets, and what they are doing because they are afraid if they actually move too quickly in any kind of a tightening framework, everything will fall apart, are 2 different things, which leads us back to the fact that they are really caught in a catch-22 of their own making, and we are sort of along for that flight or that ride or whatever you want to call it, because we are really ultimately going to be victims of the mistake that might happen if one of them decides to tighten too quickly, or to sell off assets too quickly, or defaults start to creep into the accumulated corporate bonds that say one of them are holding, or something happens from the outset that creates more fear in the system, and then they have to come up with additional ways to keep doing what they've been doing. That's what they're fearful of, and that's why a lot of the moves that they're making and things that they were saying are very different from the overall effect of their 10-year plan.
And unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I hope you'll come back and talk to us again when your book comes out. But in the meantime, a very few are benefiting from the current policy, but we will all pay if it goes wrong. So, Nomi Prins, good to talk to you, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.